Good morning, welcome. Good morning, everyone. All right, now we have a lot of people rolling in, so thanks for joining us. My name is Dylan Stern with the Delta Science Program, Delta Stewardship Council. You have found us today here at the 6th seminar in our Delta Research Awards seminar series. We have a really great one for you planned today. The theme is Migratory Fishes, Science Tools to Inform Management and Recovery. Next slide, please. I just want to go ahead and ask that everyone add their name and affiliation to the chat so that we can, get to know each other better. And when you see the poll, you should see the poll already at the beginning and the end. Please take a minute to fill it out. They really help us to continuously improve events like these. So thank you so much for that. We'll just wait another minute or two for others to join us. But also, just so you know, that this seminar and all the other seminars in the series are recorded and posted onto the Council's YouTube channel. So in case you want to share that with anyone you know, hint, hint, who was unable to attend, we really also want to encourage participation and discussion. So please write in the chat box, but use the Q&A box specifically for any questions that you might have. Or you can also raise your hand and I'll promote you so that you could speak and engage in discussion. So just another minute here and we'll get started. So it should be. Okay, let's get started then. Okay, thanks so much again for joining us. I'd like Megan, first of all, Megan Nguyen, to introduce herself really quickly. She's helping to lead this effort as our Sea Grant Fellow. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, my name is Megan Nguyen. I'm pretty sure the speakers know me, but I'm really excited to be a part of this series, and I'm excited for everyone to have a listen into what these presenters have today. It's super exciting. Yeah, enjoy.
Thanks, Megan. So this seminar is open to the public and it's being recorded, just so you know. The format for today is that the presenters will have a total of 30 minutes each to present, and then we'll immediately take questions and discussion, and there might be time at the end for additional discussion as well. So please add your questions to the Q&A box, or you can raise your hand and I can promote you to speak. And just remember, there are no bad questions, so be brave and go ahead and ask your questions. And I will now go ahead and hand it over to the Delta lead scientist, Dr. Lisa Marie Wyndham-Myers. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Dylan. And let me get my video on.
And turn on your sound.
And turn on my sound. I don't have the sound control. Let's see here.
I can hear you. They can hear you. Yeah.
Great. Well, then I'll just speak if you can hear me. Okay. Great. All right. I am going to get, is my video's on, but nobody can see me. Is that right?
They can see.
Okay. Well, then I think we're okay.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you, Dylan, for the introduction and this whole team. This is the 6th in a series, and it's just been wonderful to see it develop all of this time. Good morning, everybody. I'm Lisa Marie Wyndham-Myers, the Delta lead scientist serving the Delta Stewardship Council. And I'm thrilled to welcome you today to this 6th seminar that's highlighting results from 2 projects. The first project was funded by the Delta Stewardship Council as part of the 2021 Delta Research Awards, and the second was through a directed action. Both projects projects were specifically to address critical knowledge gaps identified in the 2017 Science Action Agenda. So just a reminder, please do introduce yourself and share your name and affiliation in the chat. Don't be shy about using the Q&A and the chat throughout the hour, because we do monitor it, and then we can convey that forward in this discussion enhanced session. So first, I do want to provide a little bit of background about the Council and the Delta Science Program. The Delta Stewardship Council, including the Delta Science Program, was created through the 2009 Delta Reform Act. And the Delta Science Program was charged with providing the best possible scientific information to inform water and environmental decisions for decision-making in the Delta. One of the ways that we provide the best possible science is by funding science research such as this in the Delta, including through competitive research calls like the Delta Research Awards. Directed actions, like our second project today, are critical science investigations that the Delta Science Program awards through a non-competitive process when there is clear and pressing need, but also it must be responsive to those Science Action Agenda priority topics. So our science funding efforts work hand in hand with two key tools: the Science Action Agenda, as I mentioned, which is now in its 2022 through 2026 version, and the Delta Science Tracker. The Science Action Agenda is a collaboratively developed document that identifies management relevant research priorities, and the Delta Science Tracker is a web-based tool that inventories research projects across the Delta. And I encourage you to put any of your projects into the Delta Science Tracker. That's how we are able to collaborate across multiple teams. And of course, the purpose of today is to go beyond simply funding science, but ensuring that that science includes results and management implications that are communicated. So next slide. Thank you. Towards those communications, we also like to hear back from you. So we have a Grand Challenges draft essay. I'm going to get to the talks very shortly, but I want to make sure you know that we are looking for your participation in some other efforts. So the Grand Challenges draft essay is open for one more day to make comments. This is what we're hoping to use to do updates to the Delta Science Plan in 2025. So take a look. You can find a QR code later to get to our main website if you'd like. And the Science for Communities workshop is on July 12th. That's tomorrow. That's in Stockton. And this is our second.
On Friday.
Yeah, sorry, it's tomorrow on Friday. I'm sorry about that. It's our second effort in that response. And the event will showcase projects that are created through partnerships between Delta community-based organizations and scientists, addressing topics like air quality, HABs, homelessness, and the human right to water. The event is in Stockton and it's free and open to the public. And so please join us or spread the word. And I think we can go to the next slide. And I'm wondering if we have the right slides. Oh, I guess the last thing would be the nominations for the Brown-Nichols Award. Is that on the screen right now?
Go back one.
Okay, sorry about that. The Brown-Nichols Award is The Brown-Nichols Award is really a wonderful way to give tribute to scientists who have made a management impact in the Delta, and we're accepting those nomination packages through Monday. So please consider making a suggestion and or spreading the word. So I think next slide. And it looks like the right side. Great. So as you can see, we're in the 6th in our series. And each seminar in the past is available on our YouTube site, and they all include 2 presentations on a shared theme. Today's theme is migratory fishes, and in particular, science tools to inform management and recovery. I just want to provide a brief intro to the talks we're going to hear today. The theme of the seminars I've just mentioned, the first project is by Dr. Henderson and Dr. Jordan Massie from University of Vermont and colleagues. This project synthesized salmon movement data to identify predation hotspots and understand how habitat water management affects habitat water management actions affect salmon survival in the Sacramento River and Delta. This research specifically addressed Science Action Agenda Actions 2 and 4. We can get into that in a bit. This second project is by Dr. Jasmine Williamshen from Cramer Fish Sciences and colleagues. This project aims to centralize and standardize telemetry data workflows for fish ecology research in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta by creating open source, accessible resources and tools. This research addressed Science Action Agenda topics 2 and 5. And these projects' key objectives, background, management applications, and a Science Action Agenda relevance are summarized in an info sheet that will be available soon on our events webpage and science tracker. I also want to just plug next week's talk, same format, which will be on multi-benefit wetland habitat and delta food webs, again, on July 17th. And then more to come, we have 3 projects that have been rescheduled to spring 2025. Dr. Renee Henry's Trout Unlimited presentation titled Reorienting to Recovery. Dr. Russ Perry from U.S. Geological Survey and Dr. Rebecca Buchanan will also from the University of Washington will also present on their respective salmon projects next spring. So please consider joining us for those upcoming seminars and spreading the word. So next slide. Thank you. So now I would like to hand it over to Dr. Jordan Massie, a postdoctoral associate at the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont. And I think we can see here that she's ready to move forward. We're looking forward to your presentation today, Dr. Massie.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lisa Marie. Oh, excellent. And it looks like slide sharing is working. So thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here, everybody. Greetings from the other side of the country at the University of Vermont in Burlington. My name is Jordan Massie, and I work with Dr. Mark Henderson, who is our unit leader of the Vermont Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit with the U.S. Geological Survey. And today I'm going to be talking about some of our ongoing research, which is investigating the survival of outmigrating Chinook salmon smolt throughout the Sacramento River, with a special emphasis on predation. So to kind of start out, I do want to mention this is a large and collaborative effort, and special thanks to the Delta Stewardship Council, who is fully funding this research, and without it, none of this would be possible. But we're also actively working with other branches of the USGS, collaborators at the NOAA Southeast Fisheries Science Center, UC Santa Cruz Fish and Wildlife Service, who are all very valuable to these efforts. So to kind of start out, most of the folks probably joining are somewhat familiar with natural resource issues on the West Coast, and some of the plights of the Pacific salmon can sometimes be a little bit of a sad story, but that's why we're here, is to try to make a tangible difference in species recovery. But there's been a massive decline of Pacific salmon, including in California's Central Valley over the last century plus. And this stems to what biologists oftentimes refer to as the 4 H's: hatcheries, harvest, habitat, and hydropower, which have really kind of put a large impediment into recovery. So one of the biggest problems is habitat loss and degradation. The Sacramento-San Joaquin and the Delta are still experiencing some of the legacy effects of gold mining over a century ago, increased urbanization as people have moved west throughout the 18th and 1900s, and revetment and channelization of the river have really degraded a lot of the habitat. Early on, intensive harvest, where the fish wheels and the docks and canneries were built at the mouth of the river down in the bay, put a large dent in the populations that have never fully recovered. Another large issue, which is a recurring theme in salmonid research, is altered flow regimes. The upstream dams and impoundments, along with water diversion for agriculture and municipal needs, really put a lot of restrictions on the free flow of river water, which is very important to the fishes. Also, the large-scale hatchery supplementation, which is a necessary thing for recovery these days, but early on didn't necessarily have all of their ducks in a row, did kind of dilute some of the genetic stock. So these are all legacy effects which we're battling against for species recovery. So specifically in the Central Valley, research in recent years has identified outmigrating juveniles, and I'll use the word smolt throughout the presentation, as a particularly sensitive stage. One thing to note is that the smolt survival in the Sacramento-San is substantially lower than up on some of the northern rivers, like the Columbia between Washington and Oregon, and the Fraser up in British Columbia. And some of our colleagues have identified this as one of the most sensitive life stages for ultimate adult returns, and that smolt survival could actually have a large impact, even relative to adult survival in the ocean. One thing that remains very poorly understood is how predation kind of fits into this equation. And it's been hypothesized that this could be a very large contributing factor to smolt survival during migration in the Central Valley. As many of you may know, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta is one of the most highly invaded ecosystems in the world. So in addition to native fish predators like the pike minnow, which can consume Chinook salmon, or avian predators like Caspian terns or cormorants, we also have a whole slew of non-native fish predators that can present substantial risks to these young migrating fish. And that includes striped bass who are migrating upstream, largemouth bass, channel catfish, white catfish throughout the Delta. And this is really a key thing that we're focusing on, to look at their role in the mortality of these outmigrating fish. So as a little description of the Chinook in the Central Valley specifically, California populations represent the southernmost extent of the distribution of the species. And while they are all a single species, there's 4 distinct ecotypes that are recognized under the Endangered Species Protection Act. Fall run, which is currently the most abundant, late fall run, which migrates in the winter, winter run, which is an endangered species under the ESA protection, and most of their habitat is blocked by impassable dams in the upper river, and spring run, which were historically the most abundant. Now there's only small remnant populations. And all of these are in decline, but as I mentioned, the winter and the spring run are actually ESA listed as endangered and threatened for US protection, which kind of triggers a whole lot of actions, including funding to be able to produce research to increase the survival or identify the pinch points. So one thing that I'll mention, you can see at the bottom right of this slide, there's this little kind of a busy conceptual diagram. But I think an important thing at this stage to emphasize is that while these are all the same species, what kind of sets them apart as really distinct population segments is the fact that there's variation in when they're migrating throughout the year out to the ocean, where in the river they're migrating from, the age at which they go out, and the size of migration. So this leads into a lot of differences, where a Chinook is not necessarily a Chinook. There's a lot of distinct adaptations within each of these ecotypes, which kind of presents a unique challenge for research looking at survival and recovery. So the conditions experienced by each of these runs or ecotypes during migration can have differential effects on mortality or pressure from predators, because it's different times and different sizes. So this in some ways precludes a one-size-fits-all management approach, and really, kind of prompts that investigation of some of the unique sensitivities. So our objective is to provide managers with information which can help address these different sources of mortality at different times of the year when each run or ecotype is migrating. So thank you, Lisa Marie. That was a great introduction and segue, but very specifically, during the early stages of this proposal and this project, we are kind of shooting to address some of these specific science action areas and priority objectives. So specifically for the 2017-2021 science action areas, we fit into 2 and 4, as Lisa had kind of mentioned, Lisa Marie, where Action Area 2 is to capitalize on existing data through increase in science synthesis. And in a slide or two, I'll kind of show an emphasis of how we're kind of approaching that. Action Area 4, as I previously described, is to improve our understanding between these interactions of stressors for the different ecotypes, and how that relates to water management, species management, and community interactions. And then I thought I'd put this in here since we are an ongoing project. We got an extension and we're continuing to drive this forward for the 2022 to 2026 action areas. This again, really fits into those goals of acquiring new knowledge by synthesizing existing data and knowledge and examining these interaction stressors to help support species recovery. So as I mentioned in the last slide, one of the big goals is to be able to utilize all of these different past studies and kind of synthesize that information. So that's exactly what we're doing in this project. And through the ERDAP database, we've been able to query and work with our collaborators to aggregate over 10 years of acoustic telemetry data from Chinook smolts in the Sacramento River. This represents over 20,000 tagged fish, and I'll talk about the tagging in a second here, using a little transmitter called JSATS, Juvenile Salmon Acoustic Telemetry System. So we have a nice sample size of each of these different runs, and including a mix of wild and hatchery reared fish. So the monitoring occurs over 200 receivers over time. So there's a lot of these pinch point or little detection areas that help us kind of understand how fish are moving through time. So to explain that a little bit more, today we do have kind of a telemetry kind of a theme, and I'm looking forward to the next presentation from Cramer. It sounds exciting, the efforts that they're engaging on. But to kind of give just a rough, quick and dirty explanation of what acoustic telemetry is. It's a passive method of monitoring fish movement. So on the left-hand side of this conceptual figure, you see you've got these little tags, which are kind of surgically implanted in the abdomens of fish, in this case, Chinook salmon smolts. They're allowed to recover and release to swim free into the river. And then on the right-hand side, there are things that are called acoustic receivers, which are listening stations, which are deployed in fixed locations throughout the river. And when a fish that has a tag swims within a certain proximity, usually around somewhere in the order of a few hundred meters to a kilometer, you get a unique signal, which associates that with a timestamp for an individual. So you can actually track the movement of these individuals over time. Very powerful, and it's an up-and-coming technology that's becoming very widely used within the Delta. So of these 200 receivers all throughout the Delta, we've identified some kind of boundary areas throughout the upper river. And we're talking about the more upper reaches of the Sacramento today. So we've delineated the river into about 15 separate river reaches that are monitored by these receiver stations. So we can not only track that movement and survival over time, but we can then tie it to the specific conditions they encounter in a river reach and the different things that are changing, like flow and temperature throughout time. I'll get into that in a bit down the road. So our specific methodology is to take these acoustic telemetry data, all of these unique signatures following individuals throughout the river over time, and to employ what's called a Cormack-Jolly-Sieber marked recapture model. And these models have been widely used for salmonids to basically assess two key parameters. One, the apparent survival. And apparent survival, I'm not going to go too far into the weeds, but since a detection is not necessarily a dead fish, it could basically either be dead or it could be not detected. We're basically using an estimate of survival along with the detection probability on each of these fish. And what we're doing here, which is kind of a novel technique, is we're using these marked recapture survival models throughout the river reaches to model survival as a function of predation explicit. And we're doing this using something called the mean free path length model, which was developed by Henderson back in 2005, along with others, as an extension of some classic predator-prey survival models. So the mean free path length model, and here's a really great kind of a little figure which kind of sums it up, also referred to as the XT model in a simplified version, where survival is basically a factor of two things. One, distance traveled of the fish, which is X along the river gradient in this figure, and T, time, which is how long it takes for those specific individuals to move downstream. So in the simplified version, we're building off the work of Anna Steele and colleagues who have kind of deployed this model to examine predation. And one of the key assumptions is that it has kind of a gauntlet-like strategy. Since these are migrating fish, they're moving downstream at a fairly directed and rapid pace. Basically, what you see is that the movement is a factor of these downstream migrating individuals moving through a field of predators, or a gauntlet. So you can see this kind of a loop in here. This little red path is kind of showing that directed downstream movement, where a migrating salmon smolt is encountering one predator after another as they move downstream. So the two things that are a key portion, which I'll kind of touch at in the results, are the parameters estimated by the model. So this gauntlet model of downstream movement is estimating something called the mean free path length, or what I'm calling lambda, which is what it's referred to in the modeling terms, which is the distance traveled before a lethal predator encounter. And the omega, the other side of the XT model, is the random encounter velocity. So the lambda is kind of that distance moving throughout the system. The omega is more of a speed or velocity or time element, which basically is modeling the encounter velocity between the predators and the prey. And basically, because we have this assumption of the downstream migration and the predator or prey movement being kind of the dictating factor, this omega basically is kind of minimized as fish are having that directed movement. That omega can kind of start to change, and we'll see this later on, as you either see more random movement of the smolts where they're not necessarily going straight down river, or as the predator movement becomes more important relative to the prey movement. So within these lambdas and omegas, which are kind of the key portions of the survival model, we're building in a module to examine the role of the individual and ecotype types of characteristics, along with the environmental factors as they migrate through time. So to predict survival or to model survival, we're incorporating covariates for the size of the fish. As I mentioned, this can vary drastically between ecotypes, the release group, when throughout the year they're released, and what ecotype there are, along with the mean annual flow, which is basically an overall snapshot of the flow conditions throughout the year that they're migrating. So it's kind of a single metric that kind of shows you wetter or drier years. In addition to that, as I mentioned, we've been working with some folks down at the Southwest Fisheries Science Center who have been using the river assessment and forecasting temperature model, or RAFT model, to come up with very high resolution 100-meter interval estimates of river flow and temperature over time. So these change, and we can actually pin them to the specific times that fish are within these reaches. So moving on to some of the results. I didn't want to go too deep into the statistics, but I think it's important to mention some of those aspects of the models. So when we examine what kind of the survival is looking like across these ecotypes, what we see is there's wide variation in these lambdas and omegas, the survival parameters between these river reaches that the fish are monitored in, which is suggesting that there's a non-uniform risk of predation, not only among the different ecotypes, the fall, the late fall, the winter, the spring, but also different places in the migratory corridor. So these are outputted values of posterior estimates from our Bayesian models, which are basically looking specifically at the lambda and omega. And again, the lambda is basically the distance portion of the survival model of how far fish are traveling before encountering a lethal predator encounter. And what you see is kind of interesting. I think the big kind of take home here is that we see differences between the four different ecotypes. In cases like the fall run and the spring run, in the top two panels, you do see a fairly uniform distribution along these river reaches, which kind of correspond to these sections I put on the left-hand side map just for reference, which shows potentially a more uniform risk of predation as they're moving downstream, which is kind of interesting. I'll talk about this in a second. This actually coincides with the upstream movement of one of the biggest predators, the striped bass, where on the lower two panels here, you can see that we do see more pronounced differences among river reaches. During points where predation may not necessarily be as large of a risk from species like striped bass in these upper portions, we see that there is a lot of variation within different areas of the river. And that could kind of highlight some pinch points as far as that predation angle. Going to the omega side of things, or the speed or the distance, kind of as I mentioned when I showed you the picture of the XT model, as the downstream movement and the speed and travel time of the prey themselves, the Chinook smolt, is really governing the survival aspect of it, what you'll see is this omega tends to go towards 0, where survival is really a factor of how far you've traveled, not necessarily how long it takes to get there. But as that omega value starts to go up, what it suggests is one of two things. Either that the downstream movement of the prey, the Chinook salmon, is no longer as unidirectional and directed. They may start to be having more of a random pattern. But the other side of things is it could be shifting some of the importance of these mortalities through predation to the predator themselves, where it's departing from that gauntlet sit and wait predator-prey model. And as you have either highly mobile predators or more actively searching predators, you'll see that omega value go up. So to really illustrate that, it's really the upper left pane in blue here, where the other panes you can see very low omega values, which is really consistent with that gauntlet model, where you start to see for the fall run a lot more variation and higher values in the omega, which does suggest that the predator movement, and this is again when those striped bass are moving upstream, may be a large portion that's explaining some of the variation we're seeing. And these are kind of hot off the press results of ongoing research, but really kind of interesting to think about as we're moving forward. So to kind of sum that up, really, again, we see wide variation in the predation parameters, and this is kind of different depending on the ecotype, when they're migrating, size of migrations. We'll get back to that. Another interesting thing, I mentioned before that not only are we looking at predation, but we're looking at how individual or ecotype or environmental factors tie into these survival estimates. So what we found, and this is really kind of emphasizing a huge body of past research and things that we know about salmonids in general, where flow is a governing factor of survival for migrating fishes, not only salmon, all different types of fish throughout the globe. And what we found is this time varying reach-specific flow. So not just are we in a drought or are we in a flood year, but what are those flow conditions in that reach during the time that you're moving downstream? These seem to be the most important as far as predicting the survival parameters through our predation models. But again, this magnitude differs among ecotypes and parameters. So to emphasize that, these are some of those covariate predictions coming out of the model. And really, I think the kind of big take home here is, again, in the upper left panel, where we see, and I guess as just a brief explanation, the way that these posterior estimates work from the model is this black dotted vertical line is basically 0, no effect within the variable that you're looking at. So if you have a bar that crosses 0, you really don't have a whole lot of confidence in the fact that that's a very sensitive or predictive parameter, because it could be a positive effect, it could be a negative effect. But as you see in this upper left panel, the fact that all different runs have clear separation from 0 shows that we do see a pretty significant reach-specific flow impact in our survival models. The other variables, in certain instances, you do see a larger effect in one way or another, but in many cases, as that boundary crosses 0, it's basically showing that it's less accurate in being able to predict what some of those effects might be. So this is for the omega. I forgot to mention on the last screen, we were kind of looking at that lambda, the distance traveled portion of the models. Here we're looking at the omega, or the time. And what we see is there's a lot more of that chatter and overlap. So it seems like that distance traveled less than the travel time is more highly sensitive to some of these environmental covariates or individual characteristics like size or time of year, things along those lines. So we see less of a clear-cut pattern with the environmental covariates. So to kind of sum that up, what we see is that from the predation models, we have a lot of variation in both of those parameters. How far are you moving before a potential lethal predator encounter? How does the time portion and the speed of movement play into that? So one of the things that I had mentioned and kind of teased is that we found that some of the areas seem to be a lot more susceptible to potential survival. And one would be the fall and the winter run, which both are kind of migrating at the same point in time. They're going downstream in the springtime. However, a key difference is the fall run fish are migrating earlier. They're much smaller in their life cycle than the winter run fish. So they could be quite a bit more susceptible to predation. They both also happen to be migrating during that upstream migration of the striped bass, which are a voracious predator. So the winter run may be experiencing less predation, which is suggested by the models because of this large sizing. Oh, excuse me. So that was a mistake on my part. So the winter run may be experiencing less predation due to migration timing, which is later in the year, which does not overlap with the upstream striped bass migration. However, the fall run and the spring run, to correct myself, which basically are overlapping, they're going downstream towards the ocean at the same time as upstream movement. These smaller run fall fish, which are smaller than the spring run, seem to be more sensitive to predation, and that's suggested by our models. Apologies for the confusion on the run type there. So to kind of tie this all back together, how is this important to management? Well, looking at all of these different specific predictions for the different ecotypes and different run types, some of the increased inference that's gained by taking all of these long-term data, putting them together so we have a much larger sample size of individuals, ecotypes, environmental conditions experienced. This can better equip the management toolbox and provide higher resolution estimates to inform models or management decisions. It could also highlight parts of the river which correspond to low survival and could potentially most benefit from management actions or restoration. And as I mentioned in point one, by increasing the resolution and the specificity of some of these survival associations, these values can be put into life cycle models that are being actively developed currently to understand the impacts of different water management strategies, future climate change on salmon populations, and how this differs among the different ecotypes. And these models can actually be used for future simulations to explore different water management scenarios, like flow release strategies from the upper river impoundments, different water diversion techniques, to see how that would affect survival for different ecotypes. So as I mentioned, this is ongoing research, and we're continuing to build and improve these models. So one of the things that we're going to the next step of these upper river models is to more explicitly incorporate differences between wild and hatchery fish, which I think is a very important part of ultimately looking at things like natural reproduction and recovery for things like the winter run, which is a very important question at this point in time. But we're also kind of going on to phase 2 of this research, where we're going to extend these models and analyses down into the delta to not only look at survival in the face of predation, but also how different ecotypes and different migration timings equate to survival, depending on the path that you take throughout the delta, whether it's directly down the main stem, off into the Steamboat Sutter Slough, out into the interior delta. And this is building on work by our collaborators and colleagues, including Russ Perry, to be able to kind of examine some of these things as predator density increases and routes are less clear-cut moving down into the delta. So with that, I really appreciate everybody being here. Thank you so much for your time, and I'd love to be able to field any questions and start the conversation. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jordan. So I also want to thank you again for linking to the new Science Action Agenda with your extension, and we're looking forward to those results. And also want to thank the Bureau of Reclamation for funding this project. And we want to open this up to questions that are coming in. Flora Cordileone is actually asking one. Do we have the ability to have her ask directly, or shall I just repeat it?
Probably faster.
Okay, let me just do it then. It is not in the Q&A, but it is in the chat. And so here we go. How do you explain the strong difference in flow impact from the raft? That was one of the the covariates that you looked at on lambda for fall and spring run, who migrate at about the same time. And same size. Sorry, but same time and size.
I'm just going to look, I'm looking at the chat as well, who migrate at the same time. And the same size. Well, so there is a little bit of a difference between that. So the fall run fish are, I believe, tending to migrate at a slightly smaller size. So that potentially could have a little bit of a difference in the susceptibility to predation. However, I think that that's a fantastic catch. And again, these are pretty hot off the press results. And that was something that was really surprising when I started to plot out some of these relationships, particularly that we see a negative effect, a slightly negative, but it does come out as a negative effect with the fall run fish in this very reef-specific flow. So I think the short answer would be we're not entirely certain this is going to be something that's going to require a little bit more digging. However, something that may be coming into play as these models kind of expand is that the spring run are actually a smaller sample size in these models relative to the fall fish. So it's possible that this is an artifact of those specific release groups that are being examined, and that may change. So that is a caveat, is potentially that spring relationship will change a bit the more fish that are included in the model. But that is something, potentially, which could be size related between these two runs that are migrating at the same time. And I'm also going to kind of open this up. Mark Henderson, who is the lead on this project, I'm working closely with the University of Vermont. If he has any additional potentially comments or thoughts on this, would be wonderful to hear. Possibly not, but thank you, Flora. I think stay tuned could potentially be an answer here. One, possibly an artifact of sample size. Two, possibly a factor of a small difference between the migrating fish, which could increase selectivity of different predator, but more to come on that front. Mark, did you want to add anything?
No, I don't have anything to add. Sorry, I was having technical difficulties, but no, I think that was a great answer. I agree with you. I haven't looked specifically at the data, but my suspicion is that you are obviously much more familiar with these data and you've been handling these data. I'm just a figurehead on this project, but that my suspicion is that it does have something to do with an artifact of the fish, of the spring run that were actually tagged and used in this project. The other thing that we've been discussing is that the spring run, the spring run that we're including in this project also have a higher proportion of wild fish compared to the other runs that are included in this. Most of the other runs are completely hatchery fish. So there may be some sort of artifact from that difference as well, which we haven't delved deep into that yet.
Thanks, Mike. That's a great point. And yes, I did mention kind of at the end of the ongoing research, that's something that we're going to be kind of more explicitly considering as that hatchery versus wild. But Mark makes a very important point that there is within these data that we're presenting today kind of a bias towards wild fish in the spring. And that basically is kind of a factor of the hatchery practices and the fact that the falls, the winters, the late falls have such a massive hatchery propagation and allows us to work with a lot more of those tagged fish. The spring, we're more aggregating the fish that are available, of which many of those are small sample sizes of wild fish.
Great. Let's move to the next question. I'm glad you're discussing these issues of variability that you've been highlighting. So thank you. The next one is from Joy Faluso. And I will read it to you. It's with the acoustic telemetry and inserting the sensors into the fish, if I'm correct, any long-term issues with it in terms of affecting the fishes? How long does it last? Does it need to be serviced? And also, if the smolt is eaten by a predator, what happens to the sensor? Would you still get data from such a fish? What would that mean?
Excellent. Fantastic questions. I appreciate that people are thinking kind of so deeply about this technology. So those are all, large considerations with acoustic telemetry and with doing things like surgery and anesthesia on wild animals. So to answer that survival question, there's been a massive amount of research kind of improving techniques and increasing survival of these fish. But the small fish, one, are not only matched with tags that are appropriate for the body size. Kind of the rule of thumb is to be somewhere in the 2 to 5% of the body weight. So the tags are small enough where they shouldn't be a burden, but also the fish are held for hatchery fish in the hatcheries to assess that survival before they're released into the river system. So they have kind of a recovery process, and any fish that are not doing well wouldn't be released, but the survival is incredibly high. The surgery practices are very well dialed. The fish are handled very quickly, and everything is done to kind of increase survival. So that does become less of an issue, and we see a very high rate of survival. From the predator standpoint, and I don't see the question anymore, so apologies if I'm missing something, but fantastic. That's not something that these tags are actually able to explicitly show, although we are on the advent of some newer technology, which is being adopted through different systems where there are now predator tags, where that little tag has a coating on it, and if it's ingested, the stomach acid of a predator will actually dissolve that coating and put out a predation signal. So you know that a fish has been predated upon. We don't have those technology for the JSATs and these data we're looking at, but as I mentioned, with the salmon life cycle, these fish have been rearing in the river, and when they go through this multiplication process and when it's time to migrate, they're making a directed downstream movement. They want to get to the ocean. There's generally not a whole lot of dilly-dallying, and they're going downstream. It's very rare for a smolt to turn around and start swimming way back upstream. So what we can do in the initial kind of scrutinization of these data is actually look at the movement patterns and kind of omit areas where it's a very clear cut that this fish has been eaten. So it's not uncommon in the data when you're looking at some of the initial quality assurance quality control that you'll see a fish moving downstream, and all of a sudden those movement tracks start to be beelining up into the upper river, which is very suggestive of predators. So within the models, there is an initial screening process to remove these clear-cut instances where fish seem to be predated upon.
Yeah, this is a good point, and it's actually leading to future research on standard operating procedures for this. And so, I guess I'm thinking that maybe the next question to take is really one for managers sort of moving forward. How, this is an incredible data set and really novel interpretations. Can you think of some ways to improve the use by the science community in general, and some of these lessons learned, and how we can enhance the results to understand other issues of survivability?
Sorry, could you repeat that, Lisa Marie?
Oh,
broke up slightly.
Yeah, no worries. I'm thinking from a manager's perspective, and the community science enterprise overall. I'm glad that you're talking about standard operating procedures, because that's actually going to be some new research that we're funding. I think that's, in spring 2025, we'll have that presentation by Rebecca Buchanan. But my question is really for managers. How can we assure that this incredible data set and these approaches that you've identified get used and really expanded upon within our community here, the science enterprise here? Because it's pretty novel, and it's showing a lot of variability between reaches and between runs. And I'd like to just hear if you have any thoughts on, operationalizing this.
I do, yes. And, getting dirty with the data, spending a lot of time looking at these, tens of millions of detections over multiple years, things become apparent. So this is incredible that we're at a point in time where we can draw on this huge body of data that's collected and synthesize that. But when you start to look, particularly, since acoustic telemetry has been rapidly evolving over the last decade, the things we, thought about answering 10 years ago and the things we're addressing now, it's just beyond the realm of even being able to fathom. So when you start to look through the data, it becomes apparent that some of these earlier studies or separate studies that are being brought together have their own questions, have their own motivations, have their own funding life cycles. So you see, particularly some of these locations of monitoring, ebbing and flowing and blinking in and out over the years, which, again, showing that map, we've been able to kind of aggregate and identify common areas to be able to answer some of these questions. But I think, basically being conscious about how important it is to continue to fund ongoing research and to keep equipment in place that can continue to monitoring. This is, it's so easy to say, let's pick up some receivers and move them to a different study or a different river, but keeping them in place to continue to build those data, continue to gain more environmental variables, this is very, very important over time, is consistency in the data collection methods. As far as an up and coming thing, and I don't know if there's an easy fix to this, but one of the great things is the fact that this raft model is being actively built and maintained, a very sophisticated statistical model of river temperatures and flow. But there is in many ways a lack of empirical data to link to the survival. So I don't know if you necessarily can say, well, we want more monitoring stations. We want to know, turbidity. There's a huge area and a lot of hypotheses of how turbidity and water clarity affects predation or, protection from predation. I would love to have high resolution or at least moderate resolution estimates of turbidity in the upper river, but you really have, release from the upper dams. Maybe you have some stuff downstream, but being able to link actual empirical rather than model data could be a wonderful thing in the future. So maintaining the infrastructure, continuing investments like the Bureau of Reclamations and the Stewardship Council is making in this research, and then building on the amount of data that we can actually link to some of these movements could be wonderful for future research.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dr. Massie. I think we need to move on, but we have one quick hand raised by Shoko Chinbrot, Dr. Shoko Chinbrot from our Delta Science program. And we have one Q&A question I think we'll just send directly to you to answer. And so Shoko, do you want to speak?
Sorry, that hand raise was by accident. Apologies.
Okay, no problem. In which case, let's move forward because you actually gave a great segue to our next talk, which is Jasmine Williamshen, talking about, she's from Cramer Fish Sciences. I always do that, Cramer Fish Sciences. And so thank you so much, Dr. Massie and Dr. Henderson. We'll move forward with Jasmine Williamshen. And if Jasmine is on, we can enable her now. And again, open source resources. This is a directed action for the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta telemetry research, focusing on science action agenda items 2 and 5. Thank you, Jasmine.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Jasmine Williamshen, and I do feel the need to correct earlier. I was referred to as a doctor, and I just had to come clean and say that I don't deserve that. I'm a biologist with Cramer Fish Sciences, and today I'll be sharing an overview of the prototype of a centralized pit database that we developed for the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta pit telemetry community. So this will take on a bit of a different format than typical scientific talks, like the great one we just heard from Jordan. Next slide. So this is an outline showing the general roadmap of this presentation. We'll start with some background on the project, its goals and purpose, then get into the prototype database itself, the workflow and the structure. And finally, I'll provide a recap of a workshop we held that was open to anyone interested, and then we'll close it with questions. Next slide. So starting with background, the contract for this project was awarded by the Delta Stewardship Council in 2022 as a directed action funding. The purpose of this project is to serve as a tool to help address management needs 2 and 5 of the 2017-2021 Science Action Agenda, which are stated here. Need 2 is to capitalize on existing data through increasing science synthesis, and 5 is to modernize monitoring, data management, and modeling. And we heard from Jordan's talk earlier, he set the stage perfectly, how useful centralized acoustic telemetry databases have proven to be. They have improved data sharing capabilities and efficiency. And yeah, Jordan's talk really demonstrated the utility of a centralized acoustic database to synthesize 10 years of acoustic tagging data. And I also realized during Jordan's talk that I didn't include any background on pit technology. So for anyone who doesn't know, pit telemetry It's also a passive form of sampling, like acoustic telemetry, but the technology it's much cheaper, far cheaper than acoustic technology. So it's much more commonly incorporated into research projects. The tags are cheaper to purchase, and so are the hand scanners, which are much cheaper than the acoustic equivalent of a hydrophone receiver. So it's much more prevalent among researchers to have access to purchase tags and the hand scanners for scanning or animals for a pit tag. So with how widespread pit tagging projects are, we imagine that a centralized pit telemetry database for the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta could also help improve data sharing that would provide support for data synthesis, greater analytical consistency, and even potentially allow for more rapid analysis and reporting. Next slide. So early on in this project, when it began, it was began by predecessor Mafonry Johnston, who's no longer at Cramer Fish Sciences. But early on, we realized that this is really a people project. So a project that would only work by talking to lots and lots of people that represent different agencies, people who interact with pit data at various levels. So we started off by sending out a user needs assessment, which was a Google Sheets questionnaire. It was completed by 13 researchers to get a sense of what the community wanted. From there, we formed a pit advisory team, which comprised a total of 15 researchers. Some switched roles, so they cycled in and out. And the purpose of this team was to steer the development of the prototype pit database and the R package. Once development was complete, we held a one-day training workshop, which 21 people attended in person or virtually. And the purpose of this workshop was to demonstrate the database and the R package, and also discuss the future of the prototype database. Next slide. So this is just a very simple flow chart demonstrating an overview of the workflow of the database. So the database is an embedded SQLite database, meaning it's accessed by making requests through the API. It stands for Application Programming Interface, and you can access it using HTTP protocol, which is what a browser uses to make requests to web servers. This might sound like foreign language to some folks here. It did to me, but that's why we built this R package for researchers and scientists to use. And the R package would serve as the interface for users to make requests to the API. So this flowchart just shows that users or researchers, they would use the R package to talk to the API, which would then talk to the SQLite database to access and make requests and actions to the database. Next slide. Here is the schema of the API, which I won't spend much time on, but just wanted to briefly show. There's 4 action groups. The one on the top left is authorize, so that's commands for logging in and logging out. Bottom left is data, your action for uploading and downloading data. And the top right is admin or administrative, so that's everything you need for creating and deleting project setup, antenna networks, and tagging metadata. And then the bottom right is lists. So those are all the commands for seeing everything that's already in the database of affiliations, networks, projects, etc. Next slide. And this is the relational schema of the SQLite database, which contains 14 different tables. I also won't spend time explaining this, but just wanted to show the table and how they all relate to each other. Next slide. If you'd like to learn more about that in detail, the link on the bottom, the fishsciences.github link, all of the documentation, what I just showed you and more, documentation for the R package, API, the database are all on that link. And additional details are also posted on the Delta Science Tracker linked up top. Next slide. So at this point in the project, we've completed development of the prototype PIT database and the R package, and we were ready to host a training workshop with the PIT telemetry community. Next slide. The goals of the workshop were to present an overview of the current functionalities of the prototype PIT database and accompanying R package. And most importantly, it was to gather as a group to outline a roadmap for the next phases of the project. So there was a lot of lively and productive discussion during this one-day workshop. Next slide. Here I summarize some of the main takeaways, which were the first one, we decided that the database is a data sharing project. 2, the prototype needs more testing and more development. 3, it needs to be much more user-friendly, and it needs a platform for 2 different types of users. And the last one that we settled on was it needs a long-term manager for overseeing both the database and the R package, keeping it up to date. Next slide. Yeah, so the group felt really strongly that a database manager would be required for the utility and the longevity of the database. And this person would oversee testing and debugging and enhancements for the R package to improve user friendliness, to engage the community and really make this something that people will want to use. So some examples for enhancements are to add more quality assurance checks when uploading data, and to also develop a function for converting and standardizing PIT ID formats to accommodate different research groups using different formats. Next slide. So it was interesting, during this workshop, we also realized there would be 2 types of users interfacing with the database. So the first type are those who are specifically working and executing PIT projects. So they're the ones tagging and releasing fish. And the second type are those who are incidentally capturing tagged fish, say because they're working on a long-term monitoring study and just out there sampling every day. For this group, for group 2, it should be extremely easy for these people to upload data into the database. Easier than the current practice of sending out an email blast to kind of people in the know. So we thought a platform of a simple GUI, like a Shiny app, would be best suited for this group, where they can just easily submit the PIT tag ID and metadata of location and other metadata associated with the fish they caught, and not have to learn how to use a new R package. But it's even easier than emailing a whole bunch of people asking if this is their fish. But the first group, the group that's executing the studies, they'll want to perform more queries and analytics on their data. So we thought a platform like the R package is better suited for them. And the level of difficulty to learn how to upload and download data for this group can be higher, since they're more invested in accessing the data. And more likely, trending more likely is that they'll be doing those analyses in R anyway. Next slide. So knowing these 2 platform types and these 2 users made it a bit more complicated and further cemented the need for a database manager. Here we summarize some potential duties for this person. The one I'll point out is the 5th bullet down. That was another great point and topic discussed during the workshop. So transfer data from other repositories so users don't have to upload their data twice. It was brought up that many research groups currently are already required to make their data publicly available. They tend to have a database in mind, such as the EDI portal or ERDAP. So if they're mandated by their contract to upload their data once, they're going to do it to that one, and they're not going to want to upload their data to yet another database. So our thought was that this could be a duty for the database manager. They could either solicit data directly from the researcher or download it from the other database and reformat it as needed for upload into the PIT database. Next slide. So finally, a result of the workshop was this roadmap that we drafted for the future of this project. And we classified it into 3 phases. So the first phase is now complete, where we really talked to a lot of people and try to figure out what would be a good database for the needs of the community. So that's now complete. Phase 2 would be a really intensive phase of testing and debugging to finalize the database and prepare it for real use. Also establish a working group similar to the advisory team that we had in phase 1. One thought was to have it as a branch, possibly of the IEP telemetry work group, and also begin groundwork for acquiring long-term funding. And phase 3 would roll out the database, which would be overseen by a database manager, and include lots of marketing and outreach to increase awareness of the database and garner wide-scale user buy-in with constant edits and upkeep and enhancements performed by the database manager. Next slide. So that's it. I'd like to thank the Delta Stewardship Council again for funding this project and all the numerous individuals who contributed valuable input and personal experience to this people project that helped guide development of the prototype PIT database and the R package. Next slide. So before I open it up to questions, I have a question for the group that I'm curious about. I have one thought, but I'm curious, are there any study questions the folks in the audience can think of right now that would benefit from a centralized PIT database?
Well, that's a great question, Jasmine. That was our question to you. So yeah, thank you for that wonderful presentation. I do want to encourage people to put questions in the Q&A. But given that you've seen where this is going and you see the 2 tools and you see different users, what's your vision of some ways that the PIT database could be used low-hanging fruit, just get started with it?
The lowest hanging fruit would be just to connect loss tags to their owners. That was the most common response we heard. It's right now it's a game of phone tag or phone telephone, trying to find the right person, and it usually, at least in the acoustic world, it tends to work out. In the PIT world, I think it's a little trickier to relocate the fish to their owner. But that would be, I think, the lowest hanging fruit, easiest win for a centralized PIT database like this. Lisa Marie, you're muted now.
Oh, thank you. We have a question. Thank you so much, Jasmine. Dr. Henderson, do you want to go ahead and ask your question? I see a hand raised by Mark Henderson.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Jasmine. How are you? That was a great talk. Thanks. I appreciate it. So I was part of the Klamath Basin working group that was also trying to develop a pit tag uh, database. And I saw that Summer Burdick um, was part of your working group. So I was wondering if you envision some sort of collaboration with that working group where you might try to develop some sort of larger pit tag database instead of, you kind of working separately. Seems like you both have similar sorts of goals. So instead of developing two separate databases, that you could work together to develop a similar sort of database and share a data manager.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And during the early stages and well, throughout the whole project, really, we were talking to, we tried reaching out to Patagus. They were less open. We met with the Klamath Basin Fisheries Foundation, and they were more open to it. It was a problem of different timelines when we first spoke, and different visions, I think. But it didn't, they were open to the idea of kind of housing our database, but I think it had passed, the point had passed where we could easily incorporate into one. So that's a bit unfortunate. Summer, yeah, Summer attended the training workshop, and she since reached out trying to schedule a meeting to talk about it. So that's still on the horizon. We also reached out to PATH, a node of ocean tracking network, to see if we could have a pit telemetry node part of PATH. There were different angles we were trying to work to make this more wholesome instead of lots of separate databases. And it's been tricky. We haven't found a way to incorporate as one, but that's definitely still a possible route. I didn't list in the future phases, but it's still in the back of my mind as a possible route to take.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I'm enjoying hearing you think about how to integrate with these other teams, because I think you have a really good scheme going here, and I think the way you're approaching this with the community and the agency input and developing this out. I'm wondering in the Shiny app aspect of it, will there be maps? Will it be accessible on a phone, when tags are found? Or I'm just curious what the level of simplicity is with the Shiny app.
A phone would be a great idea where they could do it like in the field, if they could access it and just take care of it right then. That wasn't something that was talked about, but I like that idea. Yeah, at this point, yeah, as I said, we're complete with phase one. So this portion of the project, the funding has run out. So the next steps are to find more funding for the next steps to achieve the future phases. But I like, we brainstormed ideas for the Shiny app. So keeping those on hand for down the line, hopefully when we get funding to complete the future phases, these ideas will still be there. We don't have to reinvent it.
I'm going to ask a question that's a little more general then, that has to do with other topics that might benefit from this approach. You focused on passive integrated transponders, and so the PIT need to pull these data together for the community. Do you have any other thoughts on how this this database development could be used for other metrics of interest?
The background, yeah, not really. The background of it really was pit focused. But it doesn't have to just be fish, you know, it could be anything with a pit tag. Anything really can get a pit tag attached to it. So the example that I was thinking of with a study question, it was relating it was relating to food web ecology more so. So scanning, you could scan bird colonies, you know, known to eat fish, scan those sites with the PIT hand scanner, and you know, try to get a better understanding of how avian predators could be affecting predation and survival of juvenile salmonids. So it's still PIT focused, but not entirely fish focused.
Yeah, that question has actually come up in quite a few meetings of what are the bird predation and sea lion predation aspects of survival. So yeah, lots of potential applications for this PIT database. I also see one that Miranda Tilcock has listed here too, about potentially using these type of data sets in our syntheses working groups at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. So I can see a lot of applications. I'll open it up to any last questions that people have been unable to ask. All right, well, then if we have no more questions, I want to thank you again, Jasmine, for this presentation. I want to also plug this exit poll and let you all know that we will have info sheets to share on this eventually. I'm not sure the dates those are going to get released, but the exit poll that you just got, please do fill it out if you can, and please also join us next Wednesday at 10:30 for our next seminar, which is on multi-benefit wetland habitats and food webs in the Delta. And we're specifically going to hear from Michelle Youngbluth from San Francisco State University about a project titled From Microbes to Zooplankton, What Defines a Beneficial Wetland? And then the second talk will be presented by Raman Nagayaran from UC Davis, with additional presenters being Lee Sanders and Andrea Shirer on their project, Non-Invasive Environmental DNA, eDNA, Monitoring to Support Tidal Wetland Restoration. And thank you again for our presenters today. I hope that all questions can be answered in the chat. Sounds like people are doing that. And I want to plug not just next week's talk, but also the next three after that, which I think you'll see on the slide, but it's, again, they're going to be in the spring, and they will be Dr. Renee Henry's presentation on reorienting to recovery, Dr. Russ Perry's presentation, and Dr. Rebecca Buchanan's. As you could see, we're also on respective salmon projects that were related to the telemetry work described here today. So we'll look forward to those. And I want to thank everybody again. I think last slide might have our QR code. So please click in if you want to have access to some more of our products and also these presentations. There'll be a YouTube page. And any last thoughts, Dylan? I think that's it. Okay. Thank you again so much for joining us today. Thank you again, presenters and attendees. See you next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.